The gun barrel feels cold against Diane Marshall's temple as she kneels on the rain-soaked asphalt, hands zip-tied behind her back. Blood trickles from her split lip onto her cream blazer. Officer Ryan Caldwell's boot presses harder into her spine. She can barely breathe. Sirens wail in the distance, growing louder. The young officer standing behind Caldwell whispers urgently about backup arriving, about making mistakes, about who this woman might actually be. But Caldwell only presses the gun harder against her skull and snarls that no one is coming to save her. Diane Marshall had been driving her unmarked silver sedan through the winding roads of Millbrook County, Georgia, 45 minutes earlier, heading home after 3 exhausting weeks in Washington. She was the first black woman FBI director in American history, appointed just 18 months ago after a distinguished 30-year career that had taken her from field agent to deputy director. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, she just wanted to see her husband Marcus after being away for nearly a month, handling a major counterterrorism operation that had consumed every waking hour and most of her sleeping ones, too. The weight of her position had never felt heavier than during these past weeks, with constant briefings, congressional testimonies, and the ever-present threat assessments that crossed her desk daily. She had faced down terrorists, organized crime syndicates, and corrupt politicians. But the thing she wanted most at this moment was to kick off her shoes, pour a glass of wine, and fall asleep on her couch, with Marcus's arm around her shoulders. Her phone sat in the cup holder, and she had just finished a call with him, discussing what to make for dinner, laughing about how much she missed his cooking, how the food in Washington never tasted like home. Marcus had retired from the FBI 5 years ago and taken a position as police chief in Millbrook County, the small town where they had bought a house overlooking the lake, planning for their retirement years. They had been married for 32 years, and his voice still made her smile. She told him she would be home in 20 minutes, that she loved him, that she could not wait to just be his wife for a weekend instead of Director Marshall. The roads were familiar to her, even though they had only lived here for 5 years. She had grown up just 2 counties over, knew these Georgia backroads like the veins on her hands, had learned to drive on highways just like this one. The late afternoon sun had been struggling against gathering clouds, and she had been thinking about her elderly mother, making plans to visit her tomorrow, when the rain suddenly hit like a curtain dropping. Visibility went from clear to nearly 0 in seconds. She slowed down, turned on her wipers, leaned forward slightly to see better. She was careful, always careful. That was when the pickup truck came out of nowhere at the intersection of Route 42 and Pemberton Road, running the stop sign without even slowing down. Diane had no time to react. The truck, a lifted red Ford driven by a white man in his 30s wearing a baseball cap, clipped her front bumper with enough force to spin her sedan sideways. The airbag exploded in her face, and for a moment she could not see, could not breathe, could only feel her car sliding off the road into the shallow ditch. When everything finally stopped moving, she sat there for a moment, taking inventory. Her chest hurt from the seatbelt, her nose stung from the airbag powder, but nothing felt broken. She was okay. She pushed the deflated airbag aside and looked for the truck. It had stopped about 50 feet away, the driver looking back at her through his rearview mirror. She started to open her door, thinking he would stop, thinking they would exchange insurance information like civilized people. But then his engine revved, and he sped away, tires kicking up gravel and rainwater. She managed to get out of her car, tried to run after him despite her heels in the rain, but he was gone within seconds, disappearing around a curve in the road. She stood there in the pouring rain, watching her government-issued sedan sitting at an angle in the muddy ditch. The front bumper crumpled, and felt a surge of frustration. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, reporting the hit and run, giving the location and a description of the truck. The dispatcher, a woman with a heavy Southern accent, told her an officer would be there in 5 minutes and asked if she needed medical attention. Diane said no. She was fine, just needed to file a report and get a tow truck. She stood by her damaged car, rain soaking through her blazer and skirt, and waited. When the patrol car arrived, lights flashing through the rain, she felt relief. Help had arrived. Officer Ryan Caldwell stepped out of his cruiser, and that was when everything changed. The moment his eyes landed on her, something shifted in his expression. His hand moved immediately to his weapon, fingers resting on the grip. His eyes, pale blue and cold, narrowed as he looked her up and down. He did not ask if she was okay. He did not ask about the accident. Instead, he walked toward her with deliberate slowness, one hand on his gun, and said, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His tone was not concerned. It was suspicious, hostile, loaded with an assumption that made Diane's stomach tighten. She recognized that tone. She had heard it in countless interrogation recordings, in body camera footage, in the testimonies of victims. It was the sound of a man who had already decided she was guilty of something. "I was in an accident," she said calmly, gesturing to her car. "A truck ran the stop sign and hit me. I called it in." The driver fled the scene. Caldwell looked at her car, then back at her, his expression unchanging. "License and registration," he demanded. "Now. Not please. Not let me help you." Just a command, sharp and cold. Diane took a breath, maintaining her composure. "Of course," she said. "They're in my purse in the car." She started to move toward the vehicle, but Caldwell's voice cut through the rain like a whip. "Stop right there. What did I tell you about moving?" Diane froze, confusion and the first tendrils of real concern creeping through her. "I need to get my purse to give you my license," she explained, keeping her voice level and professional. "It's in the front seat." Caldwell's hand tightened on his weapon. "Put your hands on the hood of that car," he ordered. Right now, this was wrong. This was all wrong. But Diane had been in law enforcement long enough to know that arguing with an officer who was already escalating would only make things worse. She walked slowly to her car and placed her palms flat on the wet hood, the metal cold against her skin. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer," she said quietly. "My credentials are in my purse, if you'll just let me show you." Caldwell laughed, a short, harsh sound without any humor. "Sure you are," he said mockingly. "And I'm the president." "What's your name?" "Diane Marshall," she said. Caldwell walked back to his cruiser and ran her license through the system. Diane waited, rain streaming down her face, her hands still on the hood. She knew what he would find. Nothing. Her security clearances were federal, classified. Standard law enforcement databases would show her driver's license as valid, but would not reveal her position, her clearances, her authority. It was a security measure, but right now it was working against her. When Caldwell returned, he looked even more suspicious. "Your registration comes back funny," he said. "Vehicle is listed as government property, but there's no clear owner. That's suspicious. Real suspicious." "This a stolen car? It's a federal vehicle," Diane explained patiently. "Issued to me by the FBI. Again, my credentials are in my purse. I can show you." "You're not showing me anything until I say so," Caldwell snapped. "I think you're on something. I'm going to administer a field sobriety test. Walk that line." He pointed to the edge of the road. This was insane. She had called for help. She was the victim. And now she was being treated like a criminal, standing in the rain, being ordered to perform sobriety tests when she had not had a drink in 3 weeks. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," Diane said, her FBI training kicking in, her voice calm and authoritative. "But I'm not impaired. I was hit by another vehicle. I called 911. I'm the victim here, and I need to file a report so I can find the driver who fled the scene." Caldwell stepped closer, invading her space, his face inches from hers. "You've got an attitude problem," he hissed. "You think you're better than me? You think you can tell me how to do my job?" "I'm not telling you how to do anything," Diane replied evenly. "I'm exercising my rights. I don't consent to a field sobriety test. I wasn't drinking. I was hit by another driver. That's why I called for help." The rage that crossed Caldwell's face was sudden and terrifying. Before Diane could react, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, slamming her forward against the hood of her car with enough force to knock the wind out of her. Pain shot through her shoulder. She cried out, more from shock than pain, and heard another vehicle pulling up behind them. Backup had arrived. Officer James Torres, a younger Hispanic officer who looked to be in his late 20s, stepped out of his cruiser, his body camera already recording. He looked at the scene and his expression showed immediate discomfort. "Everything okay here, Caldwell?" he asked carefully. "Shut up, Torres," Caldwell barked. Subject is resisting arrest. I'm not resisting anything, Diane said, her voice strained from the pressure on her arm. But Caldwell was not listening. He pulled out zip ties and roughly bound her wrists behind her back, tightening them deliberately until the plastic cut into her skin. Diane had been trained in restraint techniques. She knew this was excessive. She knew he was doing this to hurt her, to humiliate her. Torres stepped forward. "Sir, maybe we should just check her ID first. She says she's law enforcement." Caldwell whirled on the younger officer. "Are you questioning me, Torres? You've been on the force for what, 6 months? You think you know better than me?" Torres hesitated, then stepped back, but his body camera kept recording. Diane felt the full weight of her helplessness in that moment. For the first time in her decorated career, despite all her authority, despite all her training, despite everything she had accomplished, Diane Marshall felt genuinely, deeply afraid. Diane was forced to her knees on the wet asphalt, the rain mixing with the blood from where her lip had split when Caldwell shoved her against the car. The physical pain of the zip ties cutting into her wrists was intense, the plastic binding so tight that she could already feel her fingers starting to tingle from reduced circulation. She knelt there in her ruined cream blazer and skirt, the clothes she had worn to a meeting with the Attorney General that morning, now soaked and muddy, and felt the cold seep into her bones. Torres stood nearby, his young face troubled, his body camera capturing everything but seemingly powerless to stop what was happening. Caldwell moved around her car like a predator circling prey, yanking open doors, pulling out her belongings and throwing them onto the rain-slicked road. Her briefcase landed with a splash, documents scattering. Her overnight bag was unzipped and dumped, her clothes spilling into the mud. He tore through the glove compartment, the center console, the trunk. When he found her purse, he grabbed it and emptied it onto the hood of her car. Diane watched as her FBI credentials, the ones she had carried for 3 decades, the ones that bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and her official title, fell out along with her wallet, phone, and keys. Caldwell picked up the leather credential case slowly, opened it, and Diane watched his face, expecting recognition, expecting the moment when he would realize the catastrophic mistake he was making. The credential case held her official FBI badge on one side and her identification card on the other, complete with her photo, her signature, and in clear letters, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was no mistaking what it was, what it meant, who she was. But instead of the shock and horror she expected, instead of immediate apologies and the cutting of her restraints, Caldwell's expression hardened even more. He studied the credentials for a long moment, rain pattering on the leather case, and then he looked at her with something like triumph. "Nice try," he said. "Real nice. But these are fake." Diane stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "I said these are fake," Caldwell repeated, holding up the credentials. "You can buy these online for $50. People like you do it all the time. Think you can flash a fake badge and get away with whatever you want. Well, not in my county. People like you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Torres took a step forward, his voice uncertain but persistent. "Sir, those look pretty official. Maybe we should call the FBI field office in Atlanta. Verify her identity." "I don't need to verify anything," Caldwell snapped. "I know a fake when I see one." And now she's going down for impersonating a federal officer. That's a federal crime, Torres. A felony. Maybe you'd know that if you paid attention in training instead of being soft on suspects. Torres's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The toxic dynamic between them was clear. Caldwell was the senior officer, the veteran with 15 years on the force, and Torres was the rookie still on probation, still trying to prove himself, still afraid of stepping out of line. The culture of the department, the code of silence, the fear of being labeled disloyal, all of it was evident in Torres's conflicted expression. He knew this was wrong, but he was powerless to stop it, or believed he was. Diane had seen this dynamic 1,000 times in her career, had investigated departments where good officers stood by while bad ones ran rampant, where the culture protected abusers and punished whistleblowers. She had read reports, watched videos, interviewed victims and officers alike. But experiencing it herself, being the victim while a good officer stood helplessly by, was different. It was visceral, and terrifying in a way no briefing had ever prepared her for. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. A black teenager in a beat-up Honda paused at the intersection, his phone out, clearly filming. Caldwell noticed and charged toward the car, screaming, "Keep moving! This is official police business. Film me and I'll arrest you too." The kid's eyes went wide, and he drove away quickly, but Diane knew the video was already uploading to social media. Somewhere out there, people would see this. That gave her a small measure of hope. Caldwell grabbed Diane by the arm, his grip bruising, and hauled her to her feet. "You're going to the station," he said, "and then you're going to jail. We'll see how tough you are after a night in a cell." He dragged her toward his patrol car, and Diane's mind raced. She thought about resisting, about demanding her rights more forcefully. But every instinct she had developed in 3 decades of law enforcement told her that would only make things worse. Caldwell wanted her to resist. He was looking for an excuse to use more force. So she went quietly, letting him push her head down as he shoved her into the back seat of his cruiser. The cage separated her from the front, the smell of old vinyl and sweat filling her nose. Through the metal grating, she could see Caldwell's satisfied smirk in the rearview mirror. Torres followed in his own patrol car as they began driving toward the station. Diane could see his face in the side mirror of Caldwell's cruiser. He looked sick with worry, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. She tried to catch his eye, tried to convey silently that she needed him to be brave, to speak up, to do the right thing even when it was hard. But the distance between their vehicles made connection impossible. Then Caldwell made a radio call, and Diane's blood ran cold. "This is Unit 7, he said into his radio. "Bringing in a female suspect, black, mid-60s, multiple charges, including impersonating a federal officer, violent and uncooperative. Need her placed in general population, not holding. She needs to learn some respect for law enforcement." The implication was clear and horrifying. General population meant being placed with other inmates, not in the safer holding cells where arrestees typically waited for processing. He was deliberately trying to put her in danger, hoping that other inmates might rough her up, might teach her the lesson he thought she needed to learn. It was not just an abuse of power, it was a deliberate attempt to facilitate harm to someone in custody. Diane had prosecuted cases exactly like this, had seen officers charged with civil rights violations for precisely this kind of conduct. The fact that it was happening to her felt surreal. Caldwell glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You think you're special," he said. "You think that fancy suit and that fake badge make you better than everyone else. But you're about to learn real quick what happens to people who don't show proper respect to officers in Millbrook County. Nobody's going to believe you. Nobody's going to help you. You're going to spend tonight learning your place." The casual cruelty in his voice was chilling. This was not a man having a bad day or making an honest mistake under pressure. This was a man who enjoyed the power he held over her, who took satisfaction in her helplessness. Diane had spent her career studying people like this, profiling them, understanding the psychology of those who abuse authority. Caldwell fit every marker: the narcissism, the need for dominance, the racial animus barely concealed under a veneer of professional conduct. He was dangerous, not despite his badge, but because of it. The weapon it gave him was not just the gun on his hip, but the entire apparatus of the criminal justice system. Through the rain-streaked window, Diane watched the familiar streets of Millbrook County pass by and thought about all the people who had experienced this same helplessness, who had been in the back of police cruisers just like this one, zip-tied and afraid, with no one believing them, no one helping them, their words meaningless against the word of an officer. She thought about all the reports she had read as FBI director, all the statistics about racial disparities in arrests, in use of force, in the criminal justice system. She had known intellectually that these things happened. She had dedicated her career to fighting them. But now she knew in her bones, in the ache of her shoulders, and the bite of plastic in her wrists, and the taste of blood in her mouth, what it felt like to be powerless in the face of authority that had decided you were guilty simply because of the color of your skin. At the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, Caldwell dragged Diane inside through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where people might see, where there might be witnesses beyond his control. The institutional smell hit her immediately, Industrial cleaner trying unsuccessfully to mask the odors of fear and unwashed bodies, the scent of places where freedom ends and confinement begins. Caldwell's grip on her arm was unnecessarily rough, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to leave bruises. She stumbled slightly in her heels, and he jerked her upright without gentleness. At the booking desk sat Deputy Sharon Meeks, a middle-aged white woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a uniform that strained slightly across her middle. She looked up as they entered, and when her eyes landed on Diane, her expression shifted into something between disgust and contempt. She did not see the FBI director. She did not see a victim of a hit-and-run accident who had called for help. She saw what Caldwell wanted her to see: a black woman in custody, bedraggled and bloody, already guilty in the eyes of the law. "What we got, Caldwell?" Meeks asked, her accent thick, her tone suggesting this was routine, just another arrest in a long line of arrests. "Reckless driving," Caldwell began, taking off charges on his fingers. "Resisting arrest, assault on an officer, and possession of fraudulent federal identification. Claimed she's FBI." He snorted. "FBI director, no less." Meeks raised her eyebrows and looked at Diane with something approaching amusement. "Is that right? We got a celebrity here?" The mockery in her voice was clear. Diane tried to speak, to explain, to demand her rights, but Caldwell cut her off. "Save it," he said. "You'll get your chance to tell your lies later. I'm entitled to a phone call," Diane said firmly, her voice hoarse but steady. "I know my rights." "You'll get your call when we're good and ready," Meeks replied, turning back to her computer. "First, we gotta process you. Can't have inmates making calls before we even know who they are." But they did know who she was. Her credentials had her name, her position, everything. They were choosing not to know, choosing not to check, choosing to proceed with this travesty because it fit their narrative, because it gave them power, because they could. Diane was ordered to remove her jewelry. She watched as Meeks roughly pulled off her wedding ring, the platinum band Marcus had placed on her finger 32 years ago, and dropped it into a manila envelope. Her watch came next, a gift from the previous FBI director when she was promoted to deputy director, a Rolex Datejust with an inscription on the back. "To Diane, who leads with integrity." The irony of that inscription now, as it was stripped from her wrist and catalogued like evidence, was not lost on her. "That's a nice watch," Meeks commented, examining it. "Where'd someone like you get something like this?" The implication was clear. Someone like you could not afford such things, honestly. "It was a gift," Diane said quietly. "Sure it was," Meeks replied, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Bet you got a whole story about that. Just like you got a story about being FBI director, right?" She laughed, and Caldwell laughed with her, and Diane felt the humiliation burn through her like acid. They took her mugshot next, the flash blinding in the harsh fluorescent lights, capturing her with blood on her lip, rain-soaked clothes, and eyes that held both fury and fear. Then fingerprints, Meeks pressing each of Diane's fingers onto the scanner with more force than necessary, making the process take longer than it should. When it came time for the search, Meeks told Caldwell to wait outside and led Diane into a small room. The search was invasive and degrading, conducted with deliberate roughness, Meeks making comments throughout about Diane's clothes, her appearance, her body. "This is a nice suit," Meeks said, fingering the fabric of Diane's blazer. "Real nice. Designer, I bet. Where'd you really get it? What'd you have to do for it?" The insinuation made Diane's skin crawl. "I bought it," she said through gritted teeth. "With money I earned through 30 years of federal service." 30 years, Meeks repeated mockingly. "In the FBI. Right, and I'm the Queen of England." She continued the search, and when she was done, she handed Diane an orange jumpsuit. "Put this on. Your fancy clothes will be stored with your other belongings. Though if you really are going to gen pop like Caldwell wants, you might not see them again. Things tend to go missing." Diane changed into the jumpsuit, her hands shaking slightly, and when she emerged, Meeks was waiting to escort her to a cell. But before they could leave the booking area, voices rose in the hallway. Torres was arguing with Caldwell, their words carrying through the partially open door. "We need to verify her identity," Torres was saying, his voice tight with stress. "Those credentials looked real to me. What if she is who she says she is? What if we're making a huge mistake? Are you questioning me? Caldwell's voice was low and dangerous. Because it sounds like you're questioning me, Torres. And that's not going to go well for you. You're still on probation. You can be fired any time in the first year, for any reason. You understand what I'm saying? The threat was explicit. Toe the line or lose your job. Torres went quiet, and Diane heard his footsteps walking away, defeated. The system had swallowed another good officer's conscience. The culture of silence and self-preservation winning again. Meeks led Diane down a corridor, past holding cells where other inmates watched their progress, with varying degrees of interest. But they did not stop at those cells. They kept walking, toward the back, toward the section marked General Population, where the longer-term inmates waited for trial or transfer. This was where Caldwell wanted her. This was where he thought she would learn her lesson. Diane's heart pounded, but she kept her head high, her training screaming at her to stay alert, stay aware, survive. Then, suddenly, the front doors of the station burst open with enough force to rattle the glass. Heavy footsteps echoed through the building, rapid and purposeful. Meeks stopped, turning toward the sound. Diane turned too. And there, striding through the booking area with his badge held high and his face transformed by fury, was Marcus Marshall, her husband, the chief of the Millbrook Police Department. He had been trying to reach her phone for over an hour. When she had not answered, when her car's emergency system had pinged her location, and then she had never called him back, when her GPS had shown her at the station but she still did not call, he had known something was catastrophically wrong. He had tracked her using the app they shared for safety, the one they had installed after a case years ago when an agent's family needed emergency contact. He had driven to the station immediately, his mind running through terrible possibilities, and now he stood in the booking area, seeing his wife in an orange jumpsuit with blood on her face and zip-tie marks on her wrists. Marcus's eyes swept the room, taking in everything instantly. His wife in custody, her condition, the smug satisfaction on Meeks's face that was already morphing into horror. But Caldwell, who had emerged from his office at the commotion, did not recognize Marcus. The police chief rarely came to the sheriff's department, and when he did, he wore civilian clothes as he did now. Jeans, a button-down shirt, no uniform. Caldwell saw only another black man, angry and out of place. "Who the hell are you?" Caldwell demanded. "This is official business. You need to leave. Now." Marcus, slowly, deliberately, pulled out his badge and identification, holding them up so everyone could see. "I'm Police Chief Marcus Marshall," he said, his voice deadly calm in the way that Diane recognized as his most dangerous tone. "And I'm asking who put restraints on my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room understood instantly that the world had just shifted on its axis. Meeks took an actual step backward, her face going pale. Torres, who had reappeared at the commotion, looked relieved and terrified in equal measure. But it was Caldwell's face that Diane watched. And what she saw there was not immediate remorse or horror at the mistake he had made. What she saw was a man calculating his next move, a man who even now was looking for a way to justify what he had done, to escape the consequences of his actions. And then Marcus spoke again, his eyes moving to his wife and seeing the evidence of abuse, and his voice went even colder. "That's FBI Director Diane Marshall," he said. "And someone is going to explain to me right now why she's in custody, why she's injured, and why she's in general population attire instead of a holding cell." The shock rippled through everyone present like an electric current. Meeks actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Torres's body language showed relief mixed with vindication, his earlier instincts confirmed. Two other deputies who had wandered into the booking area to see what the commotion was about froze in place, their expressions shifting from curiosity to horror. But Caldwell, even in the face of this revelation, could not seem to stop himself. "I didn't know," he stammered, but his tone carried defensiveness rather than genuine contrition. She didn't properly identify herself. She had an attitude. "I had reasonable suspicion that the vehicle was stolen. The credentials looked fake." "Her credentials are real," Marcus said, his voice cutting through Caldwell's excuses like a blade. "They're issued by the FBI. They have security features. And they were right there in her purse, which you illegally searched. He walked over to the booking desk where Diane's belongings were spread out, still wet from the rain. He picked up her credential case, opened it, and held it up. This is real. This is official. And if you had taken even 30 seconds to actually look at it instead of making assumptions, you would have known that. Caldwell's face flushed red. She was uncooperative. She refused a field sobriety test. She had suspicious behavior. Suspicious behavior? Marcus's voice rose slightly, his careful control slipping. She was the victim of a hit and run. She called 911 for help. And you arrested her. He turned to Torres. Officer Torres, I want to see your body camera footage. Right now. Torres immediately moved to a computer terminal and pulled up the footage, connecting his camera and queuing up the files. Everyone gathered around the screen as the video played. The footage was damning in its clarity. It showed Diane standing calmly by her damaged vehicle in the rain, explaining what had happened. It showed Caldwell approaching with his hand on his weapon from the very first moment, treating her like a threat rather than a victim. It showed her being professional, polite, requesting only that he look at her credentials. It showed his refusal, his escalation, his mockery. It showed him slamming her against the car when she tried to explain her rights. It showed him binding her wrists with zip ties so tight that the video captured her wince of pain. It showed the illegal search of her vehicle without consent or probable cause. It showed Caldwell picking up her FBI credentials, examining them, and then claiming they were fake without any basis whatsoever. It showed him calling her people like you. It showed every moment of racial bias, every instance of excessive force, every violation